It's almost 3 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. My name is Shelley Hawks, and I'm a member of the Transcendentalism Council. And I'm here with my colleagues, Victor Curran and Carolina Maciel. And we're welcoming Professor Philip Gura, who will be treating us with a lecture today. The title is From Puritan to Yankee, How I Came to Write on Transcendentalism. So he's a Massachusetts native, the William S. Newman Distinguished Professor of American Literature and Culture at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he holds appointments in the departments of English, American Studies, and Religious Studies. And he is the author of American Transcendentalism, standard account, beautiful book on Transcendentalism, published in 2007. And his other prize-winning books include America's Instrument, the Banjo in the 19th Century, Truth's Ragged Edge, The Rise of the American Novel, that was in 2013, and C.F. Martin and His Guitars, and that was 2003. And Professor Gura received his PhD in the history of American civilization from Harvard University. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Gura. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a thrill to be talking to people in Concord, even if I can't be in front of you. The only time I was more excited was when I spoke at the Harvard Divinity School, another place, which of course is sacred to people who study Transcendentalism. I have a paper today which is partially personal, and then toward the end, since I'm speaking to people who in fact are churchgoers, at least most of you, a little bit of religious talk as well toward the end of the paper to make you understand further what I mean by the relationship between the Puritans and the Transcendentalists. I offer this talk as an answer to a question I've been asked many times, and one that I've many times asked myself. How could someone who's written on Transcendentalism also write sympathetically about the American Puritans, which indeed were the subject of my second book and other subsequent work? I can remember quite well how I first became interested in Transcendentalism. I was barely a teenager in a November that stands out from all other damp, drizzly Novembers by the horror of gunshots in Dallas, 1963. One afternoon near a field of uncut hay, I saw a chokecherry tree full of chattering yellow birds. As large as robins, in their aura, they seemed immense, surreal, with black wings and oversized finch bills working their way through the fermenting fruit. Twice as big and amazingly bright, I knew these were not goldfinches, and against a crystalline late autumn sky, these birds were garish, so noisy as to be brash, unforgettable when 5 minutes later, as oblivious of me as I was entranced by them, they flew when the last cherry was gone. What were they? When I discovered that Peterson's bird guide was checked out of our small public library, I convinced the librarian to help me locate the addresses of natural history museums and curators. I was convinced who would want to know what I considered my important discovery. I sent off several handwritten letters addressed to the curator of birds at the Smithsonian, the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and other such august institutions. Well, as you might expect, months passed without any answer. And then one day there appeared in the mailbox a hand-addressed envelope from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, with a brief letter hastily written on the stationery of the curator of ornithology. Undoubtedly evening grosbeaks, a large cousin of the goldfinch, he wrote, signed Dean Amadon. And so the birds were uncommon, though not overly rare visitors from northern climes. The extraordinary thing, as I subsequently learned, was not that the birds themselves, but that one of the world's foremost ornithologists, Dean Amadon, had taken the time to answer a schoolboy's scrawl. That was the beginning of my serious interest in nature study, and through the enthusiastic encouragement of an 8th grade English teacher, I soon found the work so thorough, and through him the Transcendentalists and their world. Then in college, I fell under the spell of Alan Heimert, my first teacher of American literature, and through him of his mentor, the great intellectual historian Perry Miller. Although I regrettably missed by 5 years having this legendary teacher, through his writings, he became my inspiration. What accounted for the spell of his and Heimert's teaching? The late eminent historian Edmund Morgan, whose dissertation Miller in fact directed, put it this way: Miller was man thinking, and the phenomenon is so rare that it cannot fail to affect everyone who sees or hears of it. His achievement, Morgan concluded, was a series of books the like of which had not been seen before and probably will not be seen again. When in her first college class in American literature, the future historian Ann Douglas heard Miller read, without any introduction or explanation, a beautiful passage from William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, in which he describes the Pilgrim's landfall on the Cape, she later recalled, Miller immediately assumed for me a narrative presence, almost biblical in its density. So total was his apprehension of his material that he appeared to have been there at its inscription, if he were not the inscriber himself. Miller introduced his class to books, she added, as to ultimate reality. The more I listened to Heimert and read Miller, the more convinced I became that, as the latter had defiantly declared, I have been compelled to insist that the mind of man is the basic factor in human history. And for both teachers, to know the American mind meant, first of all, to know Puritanism. Perry Miller famously said, without an understanding of these people, there was no understanding of America. I directed my senior honors thesis, but believing that I lacked the sophistication to write a dissertation on Puritanism, under Joe Porte's direction, I completed what became my first book on Transcendentalism, the wisdom of words, language, theology, and literature in the New England Renaissance. In my second book, I took the big leap and wrote directly in Miller's wake in a book called The Glimpse of Zion's Glory, Puritan Radicalism in New England, a book I, in fact, dedicated to Heimert. Many years passed, and I went about my academic business, tackling other topics. Then one day, I got an email from Louis Mazur, who had then edited the Journal Reviews in American History. He was editing a new series of book-length biographies called American Lives, and asked if I would like to contribute. It was a generous invitation. I could choose virtually anyone I wanted in early American history before 1800. I was intrigued, but who? Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Cotton Mather? Then it struck me. Why not Jonathan Edwards, who Miller thought was one of the fonts of America's intellectual history? Making the offer more appealing, Mazur allowed that he did not have in mind a definitive life and times. George Marsden was writing that, but an interpretive one, more like the mind of Edwards for the modern reader, not for the specialist in religious history, as Marsden's would be, and more like the very book that Miller himself had published in 1949 in a series called The American Men of Letters. And so in 2005, I published a book called Jonathan Edwards, America's Evangelical. It was around then that I remembered that Miller himself had also written brilliantly on the Transcendentalists, that the challenge I really wanted, arrogant as it may seem, was to continue in Miller's wake. So I turned to American Transcendentalism, on which he had written in 1950, published a still definitive narrative anthology. It was then, too, that I began seriously to consider the question I posed at the outset of this talk, the seeming incongruity of a deep interest in such seemingly different figures as the Puritans and the Transcendentalists, and more specifically, Edwards and Emerson. Not surprisingly, Miller, too, had addressed this question in 1940 in a seminal essay called From Edwards to Emerson. In an introductory note to the essay's republication in 1956, Miller acknowledged that the piece had been, quote, unhappily construed by many readers as meaning that he was arguing for a direct line of descent between the two thinkers. Rather, he wrote, quote again, what is persistent from the theology of the Puritans to Edwards and to Emerson is the effort to confront face to face the image of a blinding divinity in the physical universe, and to look upon that universe without intermediary of ritual ceremony or the mass or the confessional. I'm not going to redact Miller's arguments, but try to convey results of my own thoughts about what he termed these basic continuities in New England culture that, as he put it, underlay the successive articulation of ideas. For in working through my book on Transcendentalism, like Miller, I began to understand the different but compelling evidence that links, albeit figuratively, these two figures, and thus allows one to appreciate both. And because here, I presume I'm talking to many Congregationalists and perhaps a few Unitarian Universalists, I must admit that all this, in fact, mattered personally to me, because at that point I was indeed a member of the latter denomination. I learned that although none of the Concord group wrote at length about Edwards, the Puritans, because many of them had been divinity students, they knew his work and commented on it. Most prominent was Emerson's cousin and friend, George Ripley, the Unitarian clergyman who started the Brook Farm communal experiment. In his translation of some of the works of the French philosopher Victor Cousin, Ripley mentioned that, and I quote, "From many passages in the writings of our great American metaphysician, Jonathan Edwards, it was clear that he had a similar conception, albeit indistinct, and expressed in the language of his peculiar theology, of how the human mind has the power of perceiving and judging spiritual truth." Ripley noted, however, properly, that there was one essential difference, that Edwards regarded the intuitive power as a special gift, while Cousin regarded it as a universal attribute of humanity and the grounds of all our knowledge. Ripley added, though, that it was not difficult to bring these views about spiritual intuition into harmony, and he tried to do so by citing a lengthy passage from Edwards' sermon, A Divine and Supernatural Light. Another such endorsement came from Emerson's much beloved Aunt Mary Moody Emerson, his longtime sparring partner on spiritual matters. She lived in the shadow of the 18th century Calvinist world, and in her voracious reading in religion and philosophy, she kept a special place for Jonathan Edwards. In 1819, for example, she tussled with his treatise on the freedom of the will. On another occasion, she observed that the moral virtue of atonement appeared before me under Edwards' influence. "Ah, wonderful and joyous condition of any created being," she continued, "whose destiny renders him to his creator in the most absolute and unconditional dependence." Even more important was her reading of Edwards' treatise, The End for Which God Created the World. When Edwards says, "The end of creation is God's glory to manifest himself," she noted, "Some may think this strange and misrepresenting divine benevolence," but she added, "not a jot." She understood that if all is part of God's effulgence, so wasn't she, and thus she had reason to believe in the rightness of her own actions, a step on the way, I believe, to her nephew's celebration later of self-reliance. Another example of such early awareness of the congruity of these two thinkers occurred in 1894 when Alexander Allen, a professor at the Episcopal Theological School in Cambridge, published the still worthwhile life of Edwards. Speaking of his early sermon, God Glorified in Man's Dependence, Allen proposed that when it is said that those who are saved have their good in God, this means they have a kind of participation in God. God puts his beauty upon them, he continued. A sort of effusion of God is poured out upon their souls. But Allen saved his highest praise for Edwards' Divine and Supernatural Light sermon, for he believed that Edwards' understanding of this light resembled, as he put it, so closely the later transcendental thought of New England as almost to bridge the distance between Edwards and Emerson. When the divine and supernatural light is imparted to us, Allen added, it consists of God's own inmost essence, another transcendentalist sentiment. Allen's contemporary, Unitarian Francis Tiffany, noted that Emerson was fond of saying that in Edwards there are beautiful passages that one might insert in Emerson's essays that, quote, would be read by his most ardent devotees without a suspicion that they had not flowed straight out of the mind of the Concord seer himself. I also began to appreciate the implicit connection between these men as I studied another great liberal theologian, Horace Bushnell, who was ministered to an important church in Hartford. I realized, as he did, that all attempts to speak of ultimate reality are not only only metaphorical, and as such depend upon the always insufficient resources of language. Listen to Bushnell in his important book, God in Christ. Since all words, he writes, are inexact representations of thought, mere types or analogies, it follows that language will be ever trying to end its own deficiencies by multiplying its forms of representations. Because the words we use to describe things beyond our ken generally carry something false with them, he continued, as well as something true. One must multiply words or figures and thus represent the subject on opposite or on many sides. As form battles form, he wrote, and one form neutralizes another, all the insufficiencies of words are filled out, the contrarieties liquidated, and the mind finally settles into a full and just apprehension of the pure spiritual truth. He concludes, we never come so near to a truly well-rounded view of truth as when it is offered paradoxically, that is, under contradictions, that is, under two or more dictions, which, taken as dictions, are contrary one to the other. Edwards and Emerson also struggled to express ideas about the realm of the spirit in language that, for it to have meaning for their audiences, has to be understood metaphorically. Here, in the presence of many churchgoers, who I hope will indulge me, I want to focus on two matters, words we don't use too often, but I still think are in fact useful for our consideration of who and what we are. The matter of evil or sin, and its opposite, the matter of grace. At first glance on these subjects, these two thinkers seem light years apart. Edwards believed that since Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden, every human is born with the sign of their original transgression, and that only God's grace, evident as an inner transformation of selfishness to selflessness, freely offered, ends our bondage. On the other hand, Emerson believed that man is born innocent, but subsequently is corrupted by his increasing complicity in the world. Thus, his sense of grace, at Emerson's, which he understood as transcendence, potentially is available to any person, and thus is not at all dependent on God's arbitrary will. Emerson thought that innately present in each of us is a spiritual principle that of itself, without any other stimuli, allows one to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, God and Satan, and that this supersedes any outward law or injunction. Seemingly, Edwards would have shuddered. But let's take a hint from Bushnell and examine more closely the language in which Edwards clothed his ideas about sin. In his important book, The Great Christian Doctrine of Sin Defended, he turned first to a precise definition of terms. By original sin, he wrote, he meant the innate sinful disposition of the heart. And to prove it, he gestured to everyday experience. A steady effect argues a steady cause, he said. And when he looked around him everywhere, he saw what he called a prevailing propensity to sin. Of course, man does some good in the world, but the question was about humanity's prevailing tendency, and that clearly was to evil. One would not say that the state of a ship about to sail across the ocean was good, he wrote, if it could not hold together for the whole voyage. Considering its overall condition, at some point it would sink. So too with man and his disposition. It argues nothing for man's essential goodness that he occasionally does good. When Edwards reviewed ancient and modern history, everywhere he saw undeniable evidence of man's depravity. Edwards also was careful to argue that nothing in this doctrine suggests that God was the author of sin, an assumption often jumped on by Edwards' critics. Not so, he explained. His doctrine does not imply that God infuses a, as he put it, taint or tincture or imperfection in people. To account for man's evil, he continued, one does not need to believe that some evil quality is infused or implanted or wrought into us. Rather, Evil, he said, is privative, the withholding of a special divine influence to impart and maintain those good principles, leaving the common natural principle of self-love and the like to themselves without the government of superior principles. The result is the natural corruption of the heart. Innate depravity or sin thus implies emptiness, a lack of something that we need and that only grace can restore. So when Adam sinned, Edwards wrote, superior principles left his heart as light ceases in a room when the candle is withdrawn. He's left in a state of darkness, woeful corruption and ruin, like a fatal catastrophe, he added, turning all things upside down and the succession of a state of most odious and dreadful confusion. If the corruption of the heart is so understood, God does not create depravity, only God's withdrawing, as it was highly necessary and proper that he should, and thus man's ensuing reliance on only his natural principles for moral guidance are necessary to explain our sinfulness. Now let's consider Emerson's understanding of a cognate matter. The most men and women live, as he and other transcendentalists believe, by their understanding rather than by their reason. Remember that to Emerson and his friends, these two words mean more or less the opposite of what they do to us today. Reason for him implies the spiritual or intuitive way of knowing, which one arrives at through persistent examination of one's inner life. Reason, as Emerson put it, marries matter and mind. Understanding, on the other hand, is the natural or rational way of knowing, like when we say 2 + 2 = 4. The ratiocinations of the lower faculty. Now consider what Emerson said in his famous Divinity School address, that while good is positive, evil is merely privative, not absolute. It is like cold, which is the privation of heat, a notion remarkably similar to Edwards's. Sin is not something we have, but something we lack, he thought. Thus, as natural men and women, we're incomplete. In his book, Nature, he elaborated and complicated the story of Adam's fall. The problem of restoring to the world original and eternal beauty, that is, the world before the fall, is solved by the redemption of the soul. Fair enough, good theology. But look how he understands this redemption. The ruin or the blank that we see when we look at nature is in our own eye. The axis of vision is not coincident with the axis of things, and so they appear not transparent, but opaque. The reason, he continued, why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. For Emerson, then, sin is a result of not seeing right. And men and women do not see properly because they use their understanding and not their reason. He wrote, if the reason be stimulated to more earnest vision, outlines and surfaces become transparent and are no longer seen. Causes and spirits are seen through them. Grace, in other words, is a matter of vision, of seeing into and through things. And without it, as Emerson put it, a man is a god in ruins. These matters become even more clear in Emerson's essay, The Poet. For Emerson, the poet is, as he put it, a liberating God. In other words, someone whose work is analogous to that other liberating God, Jesus Christ. The poet's effect on us, he wrote, is to show how nature is in fact the symbol of spirit. For the use of symbols has a certain power of emancipation and exhilaration for all men. Learning from the poet, he wrote, we are like persons who come out of a cave or cellar into the open air, alluding, one presumes, to Plato's myth of the cave. We dance around and play happily like children, touched by a magic wand, he continued. Indeed, in the Divinity School address, Emerson actually calls Christ a poet as well as a prophet, persecuted because of the high chant from the poet's lips. And what was his song? Simply that, quote, no doctrine of the reason will bear to be taught by the understanding. Over time, his disciples misunderstood Christ the poet and replaced his truth with an inordinate emphasis on, as Emerson wrote, the idioms of his language and the figures of his rhetoric. That is, by their understanding, they had lost sight of his truth, which could be known primarily by their reason. Salvation, being saved, getting back to Eden, thus consists in occupying a right prospect from which to view ourselves in our world. What we need, quite simply, is to, as he put it, look at the world with new eyes. Thus, the significance of the famous transparent eyeball passage with which Emerson begins nature. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles, he wrote, at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air, and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I'm nothing. I see all the currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. The redemption of the soul is analogous to sight, or shall we say, to insight. Through it, we fill the emptiness that has marked our original sin. As Emerson puts it, at the end of nature, the kingdom of man over nature, a dominion such as now is beyond his dream, he shall enter into without more wonder than the blind man who is restored to perfect sight. And now I circle back once again to a key Puritan text, Edwards's personal narrative, an autobiographical account he penned in the 1740s at the time of the Great Awakening. Therein, he describes when he finally had what he believed a genuine conversion. Previously, he had continued to rebel against the seemingly irrational notion of God's complete sovereignty in choosing, as he put it, who he would to eternal life and rejecting whom he pleased. This seemed to Edwards, in fact, a horrible doctrine. But he remembered the time very well, he wrote, when he seemed to be convinced and fully satisfied as to this sovereignty, but never could give an account exactly how or by what means he was thus convinced, not in the least imagining that in the time of it, nor a long time after, that there was any extraordinary influence of God in it, but only now, I'm still quoting, that I saw further and my reason apprehended the justice and reasonableness of it. As with Emerson crossing the bare common at twilight, there was nothing special in the day or the event, yet Edwards's experience, like Emerson's, was utterly transformative, and it pertained, as in Emerson's famous passage, to the matter of vision, of sight. Edwards saw further. We would say he had insight, or to use Gerard Manley Hopkins's marvelous phrase, inscape, the complex of characteristics that give each thing its uniqueness, and his life became changed. The appearance of everything, Edwards wrote, was altered. There seemed to be, as it were, a calm, sweet cast or appearance of glory in everything. God's excellency, his wisdom, his purity and love seemed to appear in everything, in the sun, the moon and stars, in the clouds and blue sky, in the grass, the flowers, the trees, in the water, and in all nature, which used greatly to fix my mind. His was a transcendent experience, much as Emerson's was later on. And it realigned all previous knowledge, giving him a whole new way of living. Previously a fallen creature, he perceived selfishly. Even though he attempted to be good, his final motivation derived from, as he put it, a sense of heart indicative of natural fallen man. Concomitantly, through free grace, God bestowed a new spiritual sense that henceforth made his actions flow from a font of goodness. In his magisterial treatise concerning religious affections, Edwards explained that a saint experiences something new, something felt, perceived, or thought that can be produced by no perceptions or sensations which the mind had before. There is, he wrote, what some metaphysicians call a new simple idea. And that was a direct quotation from the great philosopher John Locke, whose books Edwards had read. In his sermon, In Divine and Supernatural Light, he elaborated, he who is spiritually enlightened truly apprehends and sees this light and has a sense of it. Another Lockean word. A new simple idea, a sense. When one experiences something new, one thereupon has a new idea of it that by definition reorganizes all our previous knowledge, makes everything congruent to it. Now to complete the circuit, after Adam's transgression, man is incomplete, lacking something. His heart or soul is defined and dominated by self. When grace is added, when vision is attained, all in the heart realigns so that goodness flows. One sees the world aright, sees what matters, and becomes a different being, dominated now by selflessness. Edwards thought all this a supernatural event, God's free gift to some people. But Emerson and the Transcendentalists understood this radical realignment as the result of purely natural phenomena, specifically a right way of seeing and understanding nature. New simple ideas can and do occur at different points in our lives, and the key is to recognize their significance and so that they have on us these transformative effects. The great philosopher William James also helps us understand this when he claims the truth of an idea is not a stagnant property. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true. It's made true by events. That is, through its congruity to all else in our experience. He elaborates, owing to the fact that all experience is a process, no point of view can ever be the last one. His godfather, Emerson, put it this way, explaining the symbolic imagination. All symbols are fluxional, all language vehicular, transitive, and as good as ferries and horses are for conveyance, not as farms and homes are for homestead. The quality of the imagination, he continued, is to flow, not to freeze. To be alive for Emerson is to be in a state of constant becoming, to realize that one is never quite there, to play on a phrase from our current meditation practices, is wherever you are now, when you see farther and understand intuitively right here now. The further wonder, and the final one I wish to consider here, testified to by both thinkers, is that there is no end to the truth one can see. We do not simply get somewhere and declare that we have arrived. No one can just say, I am saved. Here I recur to Edwards' most mystical treatise, The End for Which God Created the World. There, he wrote that we receive in return God's fullness in what is both, in his words, an emanation and a remanation. For his refulgence shines on us into the creature and then is reflected back to him, the luminary. Not to yearn to be part of this emanation and remanation indicates that still corrupted disposition of the heart. The more happiness for man, Edwards wrote, the greater union with God. But because creation is eternal, an utterly perfect union can never be attained. Edwards put it memorably. Let the most perfect union with God be represented by something at an infinite height above us, and the eternally increasing union of the saints with God by something that is ascending constantly toward that infinite height, moving upwards with a given velocity, and that is to continue to move for all eternity. God, who views the whole of this eternally increasing height, views it as an infinite height. And if he has respect to it and makes it his end, he has respect to it as an infinite height. And the time will never come when it can be said, we have already arrived at this height. There never comes the moment when it can be said, now this infinitely valuable good has been actually bestowed. The Christian life thus consists of constant movement toward a center the saint acknowledges but can never reach. In Emerson's terms, life is a constant movement or flow. In Edwards is a stream, ever more aware of itself. One last congruence I want to mention that I wish to consider important. In nature, Emerson said that philosophically speaking, the universe is composed of nature and the soul. All that is separate from us, he continued, all of which philosophy distinguishes as the not me. That is, and listen to how he puts it, both nature and art and all other men and my own body must be ranked under this term nature. The project of his seminal book, Nature, was to integrate the me and not me, to merge individual consciousness with the all, so that the currents of that universal being flowed through one. The cognate part of Edwards's work is his posthumously published Nature of True Virtue. In this last, he wrote that true virtue consists in benevolence to being in general, never consists solely in our love for particular things, no matter how profound our sympathy for them, but rather in our love of being in general, simply considered. What does that mysterious phrase mean? No virtue is true unless it stems from consent, as he put it again, to the universal system of existence. Our highest calling is to reflect the glory that constitutes God's presence in our everyday lives. True virtue, he wrote, is the agreeableness of the kind and degree of our love to God's end in our creation and in the creation of all things. So men mistake private, selfish virtue for the real thing because, as he put it, of the narrowness of their views. When they extend their private affection to others, even to a large number of people, they delude themselves into thinking that now they're truly benevolent. But they err in not understanding that people are but a small part of the related system, what he called the related system, being in general. God seeks nothing less, he wrote, than for us to agree with himself, to be united with himself, that is, with everything. True benevolence consists in nothing less than consent to the universe, an idea congruent to our current understanding of what we owe to everything, to nature, as well as to self. The quotidian good that men and women do to and for each other, the love we show for our spouses, families, communities, and nations, as well as our pity for tragedies, small and large, exemplify only secondary virtue unless God has transformed our hearts from selfishness to selflessness so that we consent to the universe as a whole. That's what Emerson meant by the not me, everything else. And we have to love it, to embrace it without regard to self. Only then do we display benevolence. When we value the earth, the planet, the stars, all parts of the universe, from the tiniest plankton to the greatest redwood, from the microbe to the whale, from the subatomic particle to the mystery of dark matter, can we say that we are truly virtuous and consent to being in general. I believe that both Edwards and Emerson knew and felt this, and as much as they could, tried to live accordingly. That, finally, is why I admire both Puritans and Transcendentalists and have come to write sympathetically about them all. They continue to speak to us about what really matters and offers a wisdom we find too easy to avoid. Thank you for indulging what I've come to understand from my study of these challenging and always rewarding thinkers, and forgive me for turning it into a veritable sermon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gura. That was really so rich and interesting discussion, and certainly has made me want to learn more about Jonathan Edwards. I'll ask the first question, then I'll let other people ask you some questions. I was wondering how you would think about Emerson in terms of reading philosophy and religion of Asia, and that he's taking some kind of inspiration from some of the ideas like the Tao and sort of some new kind of ideas. Is that something that you think about when you think about Emerson?
Oh, yes, certainly. Both Thoreau and he were very interested in that, purchase books in French and other languages just to be able to read the sacred text. Yeah, in fact, I see the Transcendentalists as really pioneers in what we would call a comparative religion today. particularly I think also Theodore Parker, polymathic scholar. And the notion was that finally what we have within us is a religious principle that can be expressed in different ways depending on our culture. So that what Emerson considered something transcendent, someone who is a Hindu or someone who is a Buddhist would define, would express differently in different language, but define in a very similar way. So yes, I would say I didn't touch on it in this little paper. I was more interested in trying to show that the mystics are another way of putting it is mystics are mystics, and when people of any religion have this kind of special vision that these two men did, it really has to be considered genuine, no matter what culture it comes from. So yeah, I'm very open to considering that, and I wrote about it for a bit in that book on Transcendentalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me turn it to Carolina.
Thank you, Shelley. Professor Gura, Emerson wrote in Works and Days that people are always thinking that they're in the brink of chaos, as he calls it, regardless of the century they're living in. So what do you expect for current and future Transcendentalism scholarship, considering their legacy of optimism and the challenges that we're facing in the 21st century?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. See, I'm suggesting that yes, there is an optimism, but it's tempered by a kind of realism about what we are in the world. I mean, what I was trying to express about the notion of being in general, if we give money to the poor or if we help people after a hurricane and all that, we consider that some kind of virtue, some kind of benevolence. But what we aren't doing, to continue the modern analog, what we aren't doing is tending to climate change, for example. That would be consent to the universe in general, and not just have mankind in mind. So that's what I was pushing at in that degree. So in that sense, I think they continue to offer us a vision if we read them aright, if we understand what they really intend. That notion of the me and not me being somehow finally in union. That's our joining with the universe in a way I think not many people are willing to do, given our very acquisitive or very, to be frank, capitalist selves who are so dependent on a certain kind of world economy that prevents us from that embrace of the larger world. So I think the ecological transcendentalists Lawrence Buell has talked about them are going to become still very important. That the notion of how things are linked in various ways that Thoreau knew so deeply, that's going to continue to be important in our world. I don't know how we're going to solve the world's problems of religious dissent and religious bickering and violence. If we could be as open as they were to these different kinds of religious views, we might make progress in that direction. But when you think about the Taliban, when you think about ISIS, think about these things, it seems, I don't know if the Transcendentalists are going to get us there the way they might on some of these other issues. But it's a good question, and they will continue to inspire. It's interesting. I had a lot of much more interest in Thoreau and Emerson in the 1970s and 80s. As kids, and then with the Reagan Revolution and with people becoming, again, I would say, so self-centered, so interested in self-development in a derogatory way, the kids became much more wary of someone like Thoreau in class. They thought that he was a crank. They thought that, this isn't the way I want to live. I don't want to give up these kinds of things. So it comes in phases, the way we understand it, the Transcendentalist vision, I think. And they really, spoke to us in all aspects of our existence. So thank you. It's a good question.
Well, we have a question that came in through the Q&A on Zoom from Richard Higgins. The question is, did Edwards transform the Puritan concept of nature as represented by, say, Cotton Mather and his denigration of the material world as a howling wilderness?
A good question. We either see Edwards as the last Puritan or the first theologian of the Enlightenment, and it depends on what you want to, how you want to view him. Mather wrote a little book, not a little book, a sizable book called The Christian Philosopher, in which he understood some of the new Enlightenment science, but he always ended it putting it to the use of his personal Calvinist vision. Edwards really transforms Calvinism by his understanding of the new 18th century philosophy of people like John Locke and others. So I think, well, Edwards certainly in that passage I read has come to appreciate nature as part of God's bounty for us. When he comes to his moment of transcendence there, remember, he's sort of in the woods, he's in the fields, he's among the flowers. Nature is not a howling wilderness for him. I think for Mather still there was this sense, and it unfortunately would continue to grow, of nature as something to be controlled or something to be used. And that certainly is how we get to the kind of consumerist ethic, the industrial revolution of the 19th century. Edwards would have had a much more large embrace of the natural world, I think, an understanding of its importance to us, rather than just, as Emerson said, in nature, it's not just commodity. Many of you know that little book. It has several uses of nature, and the lowest use is commodity. I think Mather was still certainly in that vein, where it's something to be conquered, it's something to be pushed back, it's something to be somehow civilized so that you can extend your civilization there. Edwards, I think, had a much larger vision than that.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. Or Carolina, do you have any other questions?
I do actually. I typed it because, yeah, I was wondering about biographies of Reverend Joseph Stephens Buckminster, because his auction was very influential to what we recognize as Transcendentalism because of his higher criticism and all the books that he had. And from what I could look up and from what I could find, I only found a 1849 biography of him. And it's, at least where I live, at least here, it's pretty hard to find anything about him.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's another biography of him, or if you feel like there's even a need for it.
Yeah.
And because I'm interested in him.
I don't think, I think you're right about the biography just being in the 19th century, but Lawrence Buell in his book Literary Transcendentalism has a good chapter on Buckminster, who would have been someone who knew Emerson's father, would be, as you said, very influential to the early Unitarian emergence. I haven't studied him at great length. I've read some of his sermons, but I think you're quite right that he has never received any major treatment. As I remember, he died fairly young, didn't he? Yeah, very, very sadly.
27.
And wasn't his library put for sale, and people were buying his German theology and things at the auction? But no, that might be a good project for someone, maybe for you. I hope I wasn't a little too abstruse in my presentation, but I really wanted to assume that, I mean, obviously you can tell that I appreciate these people in terms of my own understanding of spirituality. I guess I was expressing a lot of that in the way I was linking them. And so certainly there's room for debate. I mean, when Miller's essay came out, people said he was just stretching, and he was trying to put things together that weren't really possible. But what I'm suggesting is that mystical side of both of them, it sort of results in certain kinds of attitudes towards very important concepts, like the concept of salvation or transcendence, the concept of evil. I love Edwards' explanation in his book on original sin. He said, you want the best proof of original sin? Look around world history. He said, study world history and tell me that man is not basically a sinful creature. So, if you think about that, you think about, again, our world and what happens in our world, it's very moving to me to consider that. And then what do you do about it? Well, you try to to use the transcendental, was you try to rise above it and see more largely, and see with more inclusiveness for humanity. And anyway, my old Unitarian Universalism was poking through, I fear, at certain points in the presentation. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed it.
Professor, I have a few more questions in
Sure.
chat. So you were speaking about mysticism, and one participant is wondering about the new interest in psychedelics and sort of this idea of the transparent eyeball. And then there's another one. Could you talk about any connection between transcendentalism and humanism? So maybe you could address one or two of those questions.
It's funny. I'm just reviewing another book by a well-known religious scholar named Catherine Albanese, and I can't recall the title right now, but it's a book about essentially how ecstatic religion, as she terms it, it really has been a part of our heritage since the Puritan period. So actually, what I was saying today, she's sort of elaborating, going through the sort of the spirit wrapping of the 19th century, going through the work of Mary Baker Eddy later on with mind cure and all these things. So there really seems to be an interest now in that part of the transcendentalist vision, that notion of finding wholeness in some way. I've been hearing in the news, as you have, about the potential healing properties of some of these psychedelic drugs and chemicals, and I can only suppose that maybe it brings the same kind of enlightenment or the same kind of vision we're talking about here. Maybe we should all do the peyote ceremony at some point in our lives. My daughter, who spent some time in Peru, actually partook of that ayahuasca ceremony. You may know of that, where you go off with some of the natives and drink this very potent liquid, which brings on hallucinations. I haven't done that, but she has, and she said it worked. It was scary, but it worked. So I think people are in fact realizing that there are other ways to access. This is what I meant about the notion of transcendence. Remember, Emerson had his experience walking across a bare common at twilight when there was nothing special in the day. I think he said that for very good reasons. In other words, you don't have to be on top of a mountain. You don't have to be sailing a boat across the Atlantic to have that kind of experience. It can happen to you crossing a bare common at twilight. And if people want to try to initiate that kind of experience other ways, I have no problem with that. And I suspect we'll be hearing more about this psychedelic business. The other questions about humanism. Could you ask the person that say a little more about that, or a little more what he's after here? I mean, do you mean like the 20th century humanist movement, or
just says, could you talk about any connection between transcendentalism and humanism?
Well, I think if you study, Carolina's interested in some of the ministers. If you study some of the later ministers of the later 19th century and into the early 20th, when the humanist movement really began, I think that you'll find an appreciation of certain of these voices in what I might call later transcendentalism, the kind of free religion movement. I think it's all tending toward the emergence of the humanist attitude in the 20th century, ethical culture societies and such things. That certainly can be spawned through thinking about Thoreau and Emerson on self-reliance, on the worth of each individual soul. So yeah, I mean, I think I haven't read recent work on the development of humanism in the 20th century, but I suspect that people are noting this and suggesting there is a very strong connection. Certainly among Unitarian Universalists, these people we're talking about are essentially patron saints now. And of course, that UUs certainly were involved in the humanist movement as well later on in their history.
So let's see. Can Professor Gura talk about Mary Moody Emerson as a transitional figure between Edwards and Emerson? She seems to share their mystical sensibilities.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Phyllis Cole, from Shelley, you may have heard of, has written wonderful material about Mary Moody Emerson. I would suggest any of her work to the individuals asking. Yeah, she's one of them. I love making those quotations because, in a sense, she's almost like a bridge between the 18th century and Emerson, and the fact that he would continue to revere her conversations and take inspiration of her suggests to me again that he knew there were things of value in that earlier 18th century heritage. But she was no transcendentalist. She was, she was indeed a late Calvinist, but the way she thought about things was in that quasi-mystical way that I think could not but have had an influence on her grandson. But anyway, that whole notion of how you get from the 18th and the 19th century is a fascinating one, and it involves transitional figures like she had never wrote theology per se, but as many of you know, she kept elaborate calendars or notebooks, whatever you wish to call them, in which she put down her religious thoughts. A lot of material there if you want to learn more about her. Fascinating figure, and she has been written about.
Excuse me, we did have Phyllis Cole address this group.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I'm reminded of her quote about Mary Moody Emerson that she called her stepfather, Ezra Ripley, Dr. Reason.
Dr. Reason, good. That's nice. Yeah.
And she was really fond of his brand of religion, but of course her father had been a New Light preacher.
Right, exactly. But of course, Ripley was tending toward the new faith as much as he could. Yeah, that's great. And you were in his house just yesterday, you told me.
Shelley,
did you want to get to?
Yes, well, there's a few more questions that I'll field. So, what might have been Ralph Waldo Emerson's reading of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God?
He wouldn't have liked it. He wouldn't have liked it. You notice no word that I quote from that sermon or works like it. And again, see, in every theological school in the early 19th century, no matter whether it was Unitarian or from the Yale School or Presbyterian at Princeton, you would still be reading Edwards's works, but you'd be reading mainly his theological treatises, and those are the things from which I was quoting. And that's different. The trouble with our understanding of Edwards is that it's too facile to say that sermon represents everything about him. He was an incredible intellect, and he was certainly using that sermon to try to make people understand the reality of what sin meant, of what hell meant. But there's so much else that, like that part I read from his autobiography about the beauty of the world that can be found too. That I think you have to balance your understanding of him in that way. But in any event, if you were in theological school, you would read things like treatise on the freedom of the will, treatise on original sin, things of that kind, and you would argue with it. And Emerson, of course, as I indicated in the talk, did not believe that everyone had original sin or was marked in that way, but that finally we were born with a spiritual principle that, in a sense, was kind of fogged over or hidden, as I put it, by the world, by our complicit relation to what the world does to us. And that's why we can't see. That's why the world's opaque. And that's, for him, as I tried to suggest, is what sinfulness meant. But it was not something that was inherently in you. You kind of got it by not behaving properly later on. Or as Edwards would think, that in fact from birth you lacked something that had to be restored by God's free grace. So Emerson, certainly would have despised sinners in the hands of an angry God, I'm sure. I don't think, as far as I know, he did not comment on that sermon explicitly. But he called Calvinism, so you remember, the soul's mumps and measles, unquote, which I think is a great description. He was not interested in Calvinism as a theological system. But I think, as I indicated, the ways that he and Edwards talk about things sometimes can be remarkably similar, and an inspiration to us who have to read their works 200, 300 years later. That's the reason. That's what I'm saying. They're worth reading now if you have an interest of the kinds I've been trying to suggest in the paper.
Professor Gura, there is one more question. Is it true, as Marilyn Robinson says, that perception is an important part of the theology of Calvin?
Ooh. Well, I certainly admire Marilyn Robinson's writings on religion as well as her fiction, and I think I know the book from which that question stems. But I have to be honest, I do not know enough about Calvin's own theology to be able to answer that with any kind of authority. But I would say it would seem to me, yes, if we're considering that Edwards and others did read Calvin and came to these notions. I mean, I love that quotation I use when he says, "And then I saw further, and understood the reasonableness of it." That's certainly perception that Edwards is expressing there, and I'm sure that somehow that must have come down to him from his reading in the earlier theologians. But again, I'm not a Reformation scholar. I can't really talk definitively, except to suggest that it makes sense to me to have that notion.
Well, you did amazing. This was an amazing hour. I really, we all really enjoyed it, and certainly opened up our eyes to the depth of Jonathan Edwards' thinking, as well as our old friend Emerson. So, did you want to add anything before
Well,
we?
no, I thank you for the opportunity, and I've been, as I told you, I've been thinking about these things myself, and wanted to kind of get it out in a little more formal way. So again, I hope I didn't seem sort of trying to overwhelm people with all this info, but I love the beginning part when I talk about how I got interested, because thinking back now, I'm late in my career, but I can remember those first lectures by Heinrich in particular, and becoming fascinated. And in fact, I'm not a WASP, as my name suggests. I've got a different background, but I took great pleasure once when I was introduced at one talk, Philip Gura, the immigrant WASP. So, that's it's another whole question how I was raised as a Catholic, how one could get from all that to appreciation of this too is another interesting question, which I haven't quite yet worked out. But I was just totally taken by these people, and part of it is because I was a New Englander. Part of it is because I got into it through Thoreau, and then then to Emerson, and then later by these teachers to the earlier part of it. But it's fascinating to remember how much your college years could influence you in your subsequent life. So that here I am still writing or thinking about stuff that happened to me so many years ago. Anyway, I really thank you for this opportunity, and we'll chat by email perhaps a little later on.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
Just,
yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Fine. This is a big one.
Oh no.
The question is, I'm a non-believer, and I'm wondering where you think the concept of God comes from.
Well, that's a large question. It's interesting, and to go back to our subject here, people like Emerson and Thoreau did use the word. I mean, I think they really, however, meant it impersonally. So I think, for example, when I teach this stuff, I often say to the kids, the Puritans, for example, believed in what they called an all-powerful and incomprehensible God. And I say, that may seem odd to you, but I said, this doesn't mean some guy's up there with a beard giving directions. I think, for example, physicists and cosmologists probably have the deepest sense of what God is in our present day. They're thinking every day about what the ultimate reality is. And so I don't know, we began naming it a long time ago, but I think, as I tried to suggest, the better way to think about it is the way everything is, and that we don't know why everything is this way. We don't know about quarks. We don't know about black holes. We don't know. That's all God. To me, that's all God, and that's what we should be consenting to and trying to understand as far as our reason takes us. The whole business of monotheism, how that develops, that's the question for world religions. Probably it's not for me, but it's an important question to try to understand. I'm not certainly not a believer, as I just said, in a God of any traditional sense, but I think that even if you say you're a non-believer, you might somehow be struck by the mystery of the universe. That's what I would say to that man's question, a woman's question.
Thank you.
I'm going to go take my dog for a walk.
Very much, Professor Gura. Have a good evening.
Very nice.